Hi there! Today I'm going to tell you a real story about a quiet walk I took through the Australian forest on a cold morning. Along the way I followed winding trails, spotted some wildlife, and eventually arrived at a peaceful lake surrounded by trees. I'll also use different forms of the past tense throughout this video, so see if you notice the pattern while you listen. You can speak along with me and use this video for shadowing practice, or just relax and listen along. If you're learning English and want to understand how people really speak in Australia, then you're in the right place. These videos will help you understand everyday English through comprehensible input, while exploring real places around Melbourne and Australia. Members of the channel can download PDF scripts and get extra listening and speaking practice videos each month about my life in Australia. Okay, let's go for a walk. The weather was cold when I arrived at the forest. Even though the sun was out, the air was crisp and fresh. Crisp means that the air felt cold and clean in a refreshing way. I could feel the cold air against my nose and fingertips. The last of the autumn leaves were still hanging from the trees near the beginning of the trail. I let the leaves guide me towards the start of the path. The leaves crunched underneath my boots as I walked. The ground was covered in a thick layer of yellow and brown fallen leaves. I could hear different kinds of birds chirping up high in the trees. I wondered if I would be lucky enough to see any Australian birds up close during my walk. I kept walking forward, following the narrow trail between the trees and the ferns. The forest felt very still and quiet around me. It was still early in the morning and the sun was shining through the yellow leaves overhead. The morning light passed through the leaves so brightly that they almost looked illuminated. You could clearly see the tiny veins running through each leaf and forming patterns across their surface. The trees were covered in vibrant green moss, and I spotted some small mushrooms growing from the trunk of one of the trees. They were smooth and brown with tiny round caps. They were growing in clusters of 2 or 3 together. A cluster is a small group of things growing or gathered closely together. There were even some minuscule mushrooms growing beside them. Minuscule means extremely tiny or very, very small. After a while, the forest slowly began to change around me. The trees opened up and there was more space between them. Everything around me looked vibrant green. The grass underneath my boots was slightly wet. I found another tree that was shedding the last of its autumn leaves. When a tree sheds its leaves, it slowly drops them to the ground. The leaves on this tree looked completely different from the yellow leaves I'd seen earlier. They were deep brown with soft, rounded edges. Tiny droplets of water had gathered across their surface. The leaves were covered in dew. Dew is the small amount of water that forms on plants and grass early in the morning. Some of the leaves still had splodges of green on them. A splodge is an uneven patch or mark of color. Behind the tree was a picnic table where I sat for a moment to repack my bag. One of my favorite ways to spend time is taking photographs in nature, so I had brought my camera along with me. I brought this camera because it was small and portable. Portable means easy to carry or move around. but I had attached a telephoto lens, which made the camera feel much larger. A telephoto lens lets you photograph things that are far away by zooming in closely. I had also brought another lens in case I wanted to photograph something nearby. The lenses were interchangeable. Interchangeable means that I could easily swap or change one for another. With my camera over my shoulder, I continued walking towards the next part of the trail. The trees had been planted in long rows beside the path, and their branches hung low overhead. As I stepped beneath the branches, I suddenly noticed something interesting. Oh my gosh, there's three kookaburras. They're so big. It was important not to disturb them, but I carefully moved a little closer. One just flew away. It just flew up to the branch. One just flew down off the branch into a little puddle and had a bath. Hi. Hello. Good morning. Luckily, I had brought my telephoto lens with me. Through the camera, I was able to see the kookaburras much more clearly. One of them scratched its head with its wing before giving its feathers a big shake. I could see the detailed patterns and soft brown colors across its wings. I'd hoped I might hear a kookaburra somewhere in the distance that day, but I hadn't expected to see one so closely, let alone 3. Eventually, the kookaburras flew higher into the trees, so I continued walking along the trail. This section of the forest was especially lush and green. The forest looked healthy and full of plant life. The branches overhead slowly began to close together and block out more of the sunlight above me. I came across a huge fallen tree trunk resting across the forest floor. Even though the tree wasn't standing anymore, it still provided a home for insects and bugs living inside the wood. Near the fallen tree, I spotted a couple of red-capped mushrooms growing from the ground. The bright red color stood out against the green forest around them. I crouched down to photograph them more closely. What interested me most was the unusual shape of the mushroom. The cap was slightly concave instead of forming an umbrella shape. Concave means curved inwards. It almost looked like a shallow bowl. Rainwater had collected inside the red cap, like water sitting in a tiny cup. I continued walking through the tunnel of trees and could hear more kookaburra calls echoing in the distance. I wondered whether they were the same birds I'd seen earlier. Many people say that kookaburra calls sound a little like someone laughing. You usually won't hear kookaburras in the middle of large cities because they need natural forest habitat to live comfortably. They prefer tall trees with thick branches and hollows where they can shelter safely. When you visit regional towns or forest areas in Australia, you'll often hear kookaburras calling very early in the morning, just after sunrise. There's actually another kookaburra up in this tree on the branch. It's a bit far away. There's so many kookaburras out today. I thought I'd spotted another one up high in the branches above me, but its feathers blended into the bark and it was difficult to see it clearly. Even though there were plenty of kookaburras around, I was the only person walking through the forest that morning. The trail was quiet except for the sounds of birds and leaves moving gently in the wind. As I continued along the track, I started noticing tire marks pressed into the dirt path. At some point, a vehicle must have driven through here. I walked carefully along the marks left by the tires while the grass slowly brushed against my boots. The grass had already begun growing back over parts of the track again. The outside of my boots became damp from the wet grass. Thankfully, my hiking boots were waterproof, so my feet stayed completely dry. As I headed deeper into the forest, I started feeling colder. Thankfully, I was wearing lots of layers to keep myself warm. I zipped my jacket all the way up to cover my neck. My camera bag was slung across my chest to make it easier to carry while I was walking. I tucked my hands inside the sleeves of my jacket for a little extra warmth. While walking along the trail, I suddenly stumbled across a huge, hollowed-out tree. The tree was incredibly tall, but the top section had broken away long ago. Near the base, the trunk was hollow and black inside. I slowly approached the opening, but decided not to step inside. Dark patterns covered the inner wood, where years of rain and fire had slowly changed its surface. Just beyond the hollow tree, I reached the edge of the forest. A dirt road separated one section of the forest from the next. There weren't any cars passing by. I carefully crossed the road and entered the forest again on the opposite side. On the other side of the road, I found a gate where the trail continued. Only authorized vehicles could drive along the path. Authorized means officially allowed or given permission. Because I was only walking, I was able to continue straight past the gate and follow the track deeper into the trees. I wondered when the last vehicle might have driven through here. It was probably used for maintenance. Maintenance means work done to keep something in good condition. Someone might have checked the trails, repaired some damage, or looked after the forest area. While I was thinking about that, I suddenly realized I'd arrived at a lake. I'd been hoping to arrive before the light became too bright. When the light is soft, the trees reflect beautifully across the dark surface of the water. Because the bottom of the lake is covered in dark soil and leaves, the water itself looked dark brown. On still days, the lake becomes reflective like a mirror. I took some pictures of the reflections. The reflections formed abstract patterns across the water. Abstract means something that doesn't look perfectly clear or realistic, but instead forms unusual shapes and patterns. Suddenly, I heard a splash somewhere near the middle of the lake. A fish or another small creature must have moved beneath the surface because circles of ripples spread gently across the water. The ripples traveled outward through the reflection of the trees. I took a picture of that too. I didn't need my photos to turn out perfectly. Just slowing down, looking at things closely, and noticing details I might normally walk past was enough to make me happy. Taking photos helped me pay attention to the world around me more carefully. I continued walking around the curve of the lake. 2 old picnic tables sat in a patch of sunlight beside the water. Just beyond the picnic tables, I discovered a small metal bridge. It looked quite old, and I wondered whether it would be sturdy enough to walk across. Sturdy means strong, stable, or solid. I stepped onto the bridge carefully. Thankfully, it was completely safe, although it creaked beneath my feet. The bridge crossed over a small creek bed, but there wasn't any water flowing through it that day. The water level of the lake must have been lower than usual. Nearby, I found a small bench underneath a tree overlooking the water. I sat there quietly for a while and listened to the sounds of the forest around me. Sometimes, when I'd been feeling stressed, I liked taking long walks in nature. Everybody copes with stress differently. To cope with something means to manage something that's difficult. For me, slowing down and reconnecting with real, physical places helped me feel calmer. It helped me step away from my phone and my computer. Photography and quiet walks in nature all helped me feel refreshed again. They stopped me from becoming too overwhelmed. Overwhelmed means feeling emotionally overloaded or unable to handle things happening around you. I wondered how you usually coped with stress in your own life. Eventually, it was time to continue along the rest of the trail loop. The toes of my shoes were becoming damper, though my feet were still dry inside. As I walked back towards my car, I spotted tiny, bright green leaves growing from the side of an old tree stump. The stump must have been there for years, but now a new tree was slowly growing from it again. Nearby, I noticed leaves covered in tiny holes. I wondered whether insects had been nibbling around the edges. The trees along this part of the path were tall, thin, and curved overhead like a shelter. The sunlight had disappeared completely, and the sky had turned grey. The temperature dropped even further as I continued walking. I pulled the sleeves of my top over my hands because I hadn't brought gloves with me. Eventually, I reached a fork in the trail and had to choose whether to turn left or right. I chose the path on the right and hoped it would lead me back towards my car. It turned out to be the correct path, but after a few minutes, the trail suddenly became steep and I had to walk uphill. As I continued along the final section of the trail, the forest became a little darker around me, and cold air moved through the branches. Even though I'd been walking alone all morning, the walk still felt peaceful rather than lonely. I guess I didn't feel like I was alone because the forest was so full of life. I thought about how being out in nature sometimes makes it easier to slow down and notice small things around you. Near the end of the trail, I passed another huge tree that looked hollow near the base. As I walked around it, I noticed fog beginning to gather around the tops of the trees. Fog is a thick cloud close to the ground. Eventually, I arrived back at the picnic ground where I'd parked my car. The sky had become much darker now, and heavy clouds covered everything overhead. I thought it might start raining on the drive home. Even though the air was cold, it also felt fresh and calming after a quiet morning in the forest. Thanks for walking with me today. What word means extremely tiny? Minuscule. What word means officially allowed to do something or given permission to do something? You're authorized. How could you describe something that's easy to carry or move? Portable. How could you describe the shape of something that's curved inward like a bowl? Concave. How could you describe something that's strong and stable? It's sturdy. What word means to manage something that's difficult? To cope. How can you describe an image that doesn't look perfectly clear or realistic, but forms unusual shapes or patterns? Abstract. Thanks for joining me today, and thanks so much to the members of my channel. If you'd like a little extra support with your English, members can download PDF scripts and watch extra listening and speaking practice videos about life here in Australia. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe for more real-life Australian English practice. See you next time!